Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and today we are back with more A Testament of Hope, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today's piece is called Behind the Selma March. It has a fairly long blurb here covering the first page, so let's go ahead and hop into this. On the 2nd of January 1965, Dr. King, who had just received the Nobel Prize for Peace in Oslo, Norway, on the 10th of December 1964, announced that a new and more militant phase of his civil rights campaign would be initiated in Selma, Alabama. From its inception, SCLC sought to secure both social and political rights for Black Americans. On that fateful January day, King said, "We are not asking, we are demanding the ballot." Selma, located in Dallas County, Alabama, was then under the jurisdiction of Sheriff James G. Clark, an avid, shrewd segregationist. Rather than immediately respond to Dr. King's usual tactic of dramatizing racism before the television cameras, he admonished his deputies to enforce racism to enforce Alabama's segregationist voter registration laws with the least amount of brutality. Despite the unmerciful beating of the Reverend James Bevel and the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson, Clark denied King the drama he needed to accent the painful reality of Black disenfranchisement. King proved that to be more determined than ever, even Clark suspected. Clark finally felt compelled to arrest King along with 770 other demonstrators on the 1st of February. Many of these demonstrators were children. On the 3rd of February, Clark arrested 500 more demonstrators. The jails of Dallas County were bursting. Clark became increasingly frustrated, and so did King. But the national conscience had not been aroused. President Lyndon Baines Johnson, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and many others tried to pressure King to be reasonable. On the 6th of March, Dr. King called for a march from Selma to Montgomery in order to carry the campaign for voting rights to the steps of the state capitol. That was on a Saturday, the day before the first Sunday of the month. For most earnest Black Baptists, the first Sunday of a month is comparable to the Jewish celebration of Yom Kippur. Scholars have questioned King's sincerity when he and Ralph Abernathy, his chief lieutenant, experienced great vocational conflict between their clerical responsibilities as to administer the Lord's Supper and baptism on the first Sunday of their civil rights activism. From his church office at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Dr. King gave his approval for the Reverend Hosea Williams in Selma to lead several hundred demonstrators to the Pettis Bridge as evidence of SCLC's determination to march to Montgomery. King believed this would simply be they would simply be arrested for violating Governor George Wallace's ban against the march. No one expected a bloodbath to ensue. After all, Clark had been shrewd thus far, but state law enforcement officers were in charge now, combined with innumerable white vigilante ruffians. They produced one of the most tragic depictions of white racism ever captured on film. Black and white demonstrators were beaten unmercifully. The cameras allowed their entire nation to be eyewitnesses to this hideous spectacle. In his address to the joint session of Congress, President Johnson made one of the most eloquent, unequivocal, and passionate pleas for human rights ever made by a President of the United States. He revealed a great understanding of the depth and dimension of the problem of racial justice. His tone and his delivery were disarmingly sincere. His power of persuasion has been nowhere more forcefully seen. We are happy to know that our struggle in Selma has gone far beyond the issue of the right to vote and has forced the attention of the nation on the vital issue of equality in human rights. During the course of our struggle to achieve voting rights for Negroes in Selma, Alabama, it was reported that a delicate understanding or agreement had existed between myself, Alabama state officials, and the federal government to avoid the scheduled march to Montgomery on Tuesday, March the 9th. It was interpreted in some quarters on the basis of news reports of my testimony in support of our petition to the federal district court in Montgomery for an injunction against state officials, that I worked with the federal government to throttle the indignation of white clergymen and Negroes and their courageous determination to take a stand so that Selma could present a superficially calm face to the millions of Americans whose eyes and minds were trained on it at that particular moment. I am concerned about this perversion of facts, and for the record would like to sketch in the background of the events leading to the confrontation of marchers and Alabama state troopers at Pettis Bridge in Selma, and our subsequent peaceful turning back. The goal of the demonstrations in Selma, as elsewhere, is to dramatize the existence of injustice and bring about the presence of justice by methods of nonviolence. Long years of experience indicate to us that Negroes can achieve this goal when four things occur. Nonviolent demonstrators go into the streets to exercise their constitutional rights. Racists resist by unleashing violence against them. Americans of conscience, in the name of decency, demand federal intervention and legislation. And the administration, under mass pressure, initiates measures of immediate intervention and remedial legislation. The working out of this process has never been simple or tranquil. When nonviolent protests were countered by local authorities with harassment, intimidation, and brutality, the federal government has always first asked the Negro to desist and leave the streets. rather than bring pressure to bear on those who commit the criminal acts. We have always been compelled to reject vigorously such federal requests and have rather relied on our allies, the millions of Americans across the nation, to bring pressure on the federal government for protective action in our behalf. Our position has always been that there is a wrong and right side to the question of full freedom and equality for millions of Negro Americans, and that the federal government does not belong in the middle of this issue. During our nonviolent direct action campaigns, we have always been advised, and again were so advised in Selma, that violence may ensue. Herein lies a dilemma. Our course Of course, there always exists the likelihood that because of the hostility to our demonstrations, acts of lawlessness may be precipitated. We realize that we must exercise extreme caution in that our direct action program is not conducted in a manner that might be considered provocative or an invitation to violence. Accordingly, each situation must be studied in detail. The strength and temper of our adversaries must be estimated, and any change in any of these factors will affect the details of our strategy. Nevertheless, we often must begin a march without knowing when or where it will actually terminate. How we see the considerations, how were these considerations applied to our plans for the march from Selma to Montgomery? My associates and friends are considerably concerned about my personal safety. And in the light of the recent threats of death, many of them urged me not to march Sunday for fear that my presence in the line would lead to assassination attempts. However, as a matter of conscience, I cannot always respond to the wishes of my staff and associates. In this case, I had made the decision to lead the march on Sunday and was prepared to do so in spite of any possible danger to my person. In working out a time schedule, I had to consider my church responsibilities. Because I am so frequently out of my pulpit, and because my life is so full of emergencies, I am always on the horns of dilemma. I had been away for 2 straight Sundays, and therefore felt that I owed it to my parishioners to be there. It was arranged that I take a chartered plane to Montgomery after the morning service and lead the march out of Selma, walking with a group of three, walking with a group for 3 or 4 hours, and take the chartered flight back in order to be on hand for the communion service at 7:30 p.m. When Governor Wallace issued his ban on the march, it was my view that most of my associates, that the state troopers would deal with the problem by arresting all of the people in the line. We'd never imagined that they would use the brutal methods to which they actually resorted to repress the march. I therefore concluded that if I were arrested, it would be possible for me to get back to the evening service to administer the Lord's Supper and baptism. Because of this situation, my staff urged me to stay in Atlanta and lead a march on Monday morning. This I agreed to do. I was prepared to go to jail on Monday, but at the same time, I would have met my church responsibilities. If I had had any idea that the state troopers would use the kind of brutality they did, I would have felt compelled to give up my church duties altogether to lead the line. It was one of those developments that none of us anticipated. We felt that the state troopers, who had been severely criticized after their terrible acts 2 weeks earlier, even by conservative Alabama papers, would never again engage in this kind of violence. I shall never forget my agony of conscience for not being there when I heard of the dastardly acts perpetrated against nonviolent demonstrators that Sunday. As a result, I felt that I had to lead a march on the following Tuesday and decided to spend Monday mobilizing for it. The march on Tuesday illustrated the dilemma we often face. Not to try to march again would have been unthinkable. However, whether we were marching to Montgomery or to a limited point within the city limits of Selma could not be determined in advance. The only certain thing was that we had to begin so that a confrontation with injustice would take place in full view of the millions looking on throughout this nation. The next question was whether the confrontation had to be a violent one. There here the responsibility of weighing all factors and estimating the consequences of rest heavily on the civil rights leaders. It is easy to decide on either extreme. To go forward recklessly can have terrible consequences in terms of human life, and also can cause friends and supporters to lose confidence if they feel a lack of responsibility exists. On the other hand, it is ineffective to guarantee that no violence will occur by the device of not marching or undertaking token marches, avoiding direct confrontation. We determined to seek the middle course. We would march until we faced the troopers. We would not disengage until they made clear that they were going to use force. We would disengage then, having made our point, revealing the continued presence of violence and showing clearly who are the oppressed and who are the oppressors, hoping, finally, that the national administration in Washington would feel and respond to the shocked reactions with action. On Tuesday, March the 9th, Judge Frank M. Johnson of the Federal District Court in Montgomery issued an order enjoining me and the local Selma leadership of the nonviolent voting rights movement from peacefully marching to Montgomery. The issuance of Judge Johnson's order caused disappointment and bitterness to us all. We had looked to the federal judiciary in Alabama to prevent the unlawful interference with our program to expand elective franchise for Negroes throughout the Black Belt. I consulted with my lawyers and trusted advisors, both in Selma and other parts of the country, and discussed what course of action we should take. Information came in that the troopers of the Alabama State Police and Sheriff James Clark possemen would be arrayed in massive force across Highway 80 at the foot of Pettis Bridge in Selma. I reflected upon the role of the federal judiciary as a protector of the rights of Negroes. I also gave thoughtful consideration to the hundreds of clergymen and other persons of goodwill who had come to Selma to make a witness with me in the cause of justice by participating in our planned march to Montgomery. Taking all of this into consideration, I decided that our plans had to be carried out and that I would lead our march to a confrontation with injustice to make a witness to our countrymen and the world of our determination to vote and be free. As my associates and I were spiritually preparing ourselves for the task ahead, Governor Leroy Collins, chairman of the newly created Community Relations Service under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and John Doerr, acting Assistant Attorney General, Civil Rights Division, came to see me to dissuade me from the course of action which we had painfully decided upon. Governor Collins affirmed and restated the commitment of President Johnson to the achievement of full equality for all persons without regard to race, color, or creed, and his commitment to securing the right to vote for all persons eligible to do so. He very strongly urged us not to march. I listened attentively to both Mr. Doerr and Governor Collins. I explained to them why, as a matter of conscience, I felt it was necessary to seek a confrontation with injustice on Highway 80. I asked them to try to understand that I would rather die on the highway in Alabama than make a butchery of my conscience by compromising with evil. The Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth said to the governor that instead of urging us not to march, he should urge the state troopers not to be brutal toward us and not attempt to stop our peaceful march. Governor Collins realized at this point that we were determined to march and left the room, saying that he would do what he could to prevent the state troopers from being violent. It is important to stress once again that no prearranged agreement existed. Whether Governor Collins and other officials from the federal government talked with Mr. Lingo and the officials in Alabama in something that I do not know. All I do know is that just as we started to march, Governor Collins rushed to me and said that he felt everything would be all right. He gave me a small piece of paper indicating a route that I assume Mr. Baker, Public Safety Director of Selma, wanted us to follow. It was the same public safety director, or it was the same route that had been taken on Sunday. The press reporting this detail gave the impression that Governor Collins and I had sat down and worked out some compromise. There were no talks or agreements between Governor Collins and me beyond the discussions I have just described. I held on to my decision to march despite the fact that many people in line were concerned about breaking the court injunction issued by one of the strongest and best judges in the South. I felt that we had to march at least to the point where the troopers brutalized the people on Sunday, even if it would mean a recurrence of violence, arrest, or even death. As a nonviolent leader, I could not advocate breaking through a human wall set up by the policemen. While we desperately desired to proceed to Montgomery, we knew before we started our march that this human wall set up on Pettis Bridge would make it impossible for us to go beyond it. It was not that we didn't intend to go out to Montgomery, but that in consideration of our commitment to nonviolent action, we knew we could not go under the present conditions. As to our next step, as soon as we had won legal affirmation of our right to march in Montgomery, the next phase hinged on the successful completion of our mission to petition the governor to take meaningful measures to abolish voting restrictions, the poll tax, and police brutality. And then a footnote says, was originally published in the Saturday Review number 48 on April the 3rd, 1965. C. Charles E. Fager, Selma, 1963 or 65, which was published by Scribner's, and David J. Garrow, Protest at Selma, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, published by Yale University Press. So, yeah. As a march to talk about everything that happened, or to protest everything that had happened up to this point, especially the disenfranchisement of the African American, they sought to achieve voting rights and equality. And thus, Dr. King wanted to launch a large march. Even though the last meeting between, the last meeting between police and demonstrators ended in some violence. But yeah, when the police set up a line to prevent Dr. King and his fellow marchers, Dr. King was like, I will not cross that line because I know violence will be the outcome. And that is not what we are fighting for. But yeah. So, again, one of these defining moments in the civil rights movement, especially with Dr. King. But that'll be it for now. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next episode. Until then, later.